Villains, the antithesis to the superhero. The grand foe that stands in the way of all things sacred and good. The kind of person that we prefer to claim are monsters, but fear they might be more like us than we're comfortable admitting. They're also the people who both make and break our laws. How did that happen? But especially within the world of superheroes, villains hold a very special place within these stories. From death-defying conflicts, to mind-breaking schemes, to just generally being a pain in our hero's ass. Villains really do it all. In fact, many will argue that you can't even have a good hero without an amazing villain pushing them to the limits. And it was while researching one of the most famous bad guys of them all that I started asking the question, who amongst our favorite swashbuckling Cape Crusaders has the grandest coterie of conniving criminal cretins? Alright, I'm starting to understand the accusations that I speak like a 60s Batman TV show host. Tune in for the next 15 or so minutes to reach the conclusion of this pulse-pounding edge of your seat deep dive into the dastardly souls who have defined our heroes as we know them. Anyways, I was originally going to do a discussion talking about all the different superheroes and their rogues galleries, whittling them down until we had the best of the best. But that kind of fell through when I realized we'd just be putting off getting to the ultimate conclusion, which was a showdown between two very characters, the Dark Knight and the Web Swinger. So I figure let's just cut to the chase and talk about them. So which one of these animal-themed, tight-wearing madmen have collected a more colorful roundtable of costume lunatics? What about their villains help them stand the test of time? And while we're at it, what even makes a good supervillain? So suit up in your form-fitting costume with your logo of choice and get ready to run through the goofiest list of escaped mental patients, and let's discuss. So to determine who between Batman or Spider-Man has the better lineup of villains, we need to figure out which metrics we're going to be judging them on in order to put together some kind of a point system, so best to figure out who comes out on top. And by the way, I am talking about the Bruce Wayne and Peter Parker versions of these characters, since I know there's a few others, either Terry McGinnis or Miles Morales, but neither have the same back catalog or connection with these villains as the original faces who donned these masks. But yeah, so the point system. The three metrics we're going to use are iconography, versatility, and impact. Iconography basically being the aesthetics, powers, things that you can use to recognize them. Versatility is how they're implemented in the stories, what role they play alongside the protagonist, be it rival, mentor, lover, any of these things. And then impact being the relationship that the two share, along with how they affect the character moving forward, and the medium itself. A bonus category goes out to those black-and-hearted menaces who watch a video without leaving it a like, commenting, and maybe even subscribing. So why don't you do yourself a favor and avoid being one of those? With all that out of the way, let's start with iconography. Because while there are many signifiers that make a villain stand out, the first thing you're obviously going to judge when you're looking at the book of a character is, the cover. And both coming from comic books, Batman and Spider-Man, their villains are obviously going to stand out from your run-of-the-mill real-world baddies, wearing things like casual outfits or business suit attires. And the thing I love about both these lineups is that the villains seem to be following some kind of a motif established by the hero they're facing off against. A great deal of Spider-Man's villains are all animal-themed, with, the odd vampire thrown in for safe measure.
I'm fed up with this world.
Creating this sort of battle between creatures of nature, set within the concrete jungle of New York. The metaphors really write themselves.
A metaphor.
With scorpions to rhinos to lizards to even big game hunters, anything seems to be on the table when this contest kicks off between the most dangerous prey. Meanwhile, over in Gotham, Batman's villains are more centered around the theme of fear and psychosis. From the paranoid delusions of Mad Hatter, to the body dysmorphia of Clayface, the compulsive tendencies of the Riddler, and the ecomania of Poison Ivy. It becomes very clear why these whack jobs always end up landing themselves in the nut bin known as Arkham after Batman foils their plans. And I really appreciate that the psychological spin on these villains is much more subdued compared to the over-the-top nature of Spider-Man's foes, who are usually some combination of, what if a man crossed with an animal? And what if we just staple on a creepy Halloween mask and call it a day? But while I respect the subtlety of Gotham's miscreants, you can't deny that, aesthetically, Spider-Man's villains are far more exciting to look at on a splash page. With the ridiculous powers and colorful gadgets, it's just a joy getting to see these capers unfold, set across the skyline of Manhattan. And what really sets them over the edge is that even the less than super villains, like the organized mobs and gangs, well, in Spider-Man's case, these guys also come with a great degree of style and flair. Batman's mob-based criminals like the Falcones and the Maronis, while threatening and part of some very good stories in their own right, are at the end of the day just pretty much old-school gangsters who slowly get phased out by the more over-the-top nut jobs that end up running this city. But meanwhile, on Spider-Man's front, when he's not dealing with sci-fi abominations like spider slayers and animal mutants, his grounded gangster-style villains like Silvermane, Hammerhead, and the Kingpin all come equipped with a distinct look that makes them stand apart from one another. From Silvermane's decrepit body making him look like a 100-year-old mummy in a business suit, or RoboCop if he were an octogenarian, to Hammerhead's Tommy gun-wielding flat-top face with a big chunk of metal in it making his head invulnerable, to even Wilson Fisk, who literally and figuratively takes up every single room he enters. There's no denying that even though these guys don't shoot lightning from their fingertips or fly around in the giant bird costume, they still have their own unique sense of style that helps them stand apart from the general riffraff terrifying the metropolitan area. So yeah, in terms of just aesthetics alone, I'm handing this round to Spider-Man. But now, let's talk versatility. Because villains can't just attack our hero from one front. Now that'd be too easy. If they all did that, then they'd be no distinct from the henchmen that they employ. Or from each other for that matter. No, like proper predators, they like to play with their food before they kill it. Or at least lock them in a cell and make them watch as they burn the city to the ground in front of them. Good villains need to be able to hit our main character from all sorts of different angles, and employ unique tactics in order to impede them. Each villain has to have a different approach and motivation which drives them to their goal. It also means that each one has a varying level of sympathy, so as you know how bad to feel for them when our hero is kicking their teeth in. And both have a pretty diverse cast of characters to offer in this regard. Spider-Man's villains often range from things like mobsters who just want to control the city like the Kingpin, crooks with unique gadgets and tricks to pull off high-stakes robberies like Mysterio or the Vulture, or even fallen mentor figures who once guided Peter in his formative years, only to break bad and turn into corrupt monsters themselves. Often this is how characters like Dr. Octavius and Kirk Connors the Lizard are treated, resulting in a great degree of tragedy when inevitably they commence their villainous heel turn. Then you have just down and out psychopaths like Taskmaster, Electro, and one of the most dangerous of them all, Carnage. In fact, a great deal of Spider-Man's villains can be classified as having severe mental deficiencies, causing them to lash out in such erratic behaviors. But while I do think this helps them stand out from other Marvel characters who typically just go up against evil businessmen, extraterrestrial aliens, or global terrorists, within his circle of the universe, the fact that there are just so many mad scientists that he contends with means it kind of repeats itself after a while. I mean, how many of these guys could you consider something of a scientist themselves? But meanwhile, over in Batman's neck of the woods, despite most of them falling into the trap of being a few pills short of a pharmacy, the types of crimes that they get up to are far more varied and personalized. Characters like the Penguin and Scarface will run their criminal empires and engage in gang wars, while others like the Riddler will create elaborate traps and puzzles. The Mad Hatter and Poison Ivy will control the minds of their prey and pin them up against Batman. And then someone like Ra's al Ghul will weaponize a global network of killers and force the hand of the world's greatest detective. They all have such varied ways of seeking to ruin the lives of the people of Gotham, and pushing Batman to his limits. Even more so than the jerks that the wall crawler tangos with, requiring him to not just track down and beat up the bad guys, but also put them under a microscope and understand what makes them tick. Which is required for a handful of Spider-Man's villains, but not all of them. I mean, we all know what Shocker's motivation is.
I'm all out of money!
Generally speaking, when Peter's expected to put his opponents under the microscope, it's more so literal in the sense of he has to put together some kind of a scientific concoction to take them out of commission, rather than partaking in the psychological warfare that they're waging on him. So yeah, to conclude this round, Batman's villains are more dynamic and versatile in a way that Spider-Man's just aren't. It's for that reason why he takes this round. But now we get to the final criteria, which is, how do these villains impact the stories, and more importantly, the characters that populate them? What have they done to our hero, and how can we describe the relationship in which they share? We'll both have villains that range from just your average crook, to power-hungry businessmen, to even mentors and friends who have taken a dark turn. It's not uncommon for both sides of these individual heroes to have personal feelings about the criminals that they put away, mostly down to the fact that they knew them both in their personal life and vigilante one. In Batman's case, several of the criminals that he contends with are old friends who have turned to a life of crime. The most famous example is Harvey Dent, also known as Two-Face, who was both a close friend of Bruce Wayne and an ally to Batman for quite a long time, up until the accident that would change his life and then make him one of his greatest adversaries. Others like the Mad Hatter and Poison Ivy have been depicted as being former employees of Wayne Tech, and even characters like Harley Quinn are victims of other criminals that Batman has been unable to keep behind bars. Their stories are very intertwined with each other in a much more cohesive manner than even Spider-Man's opponents. Because yeah, while Spider-Man does have to deal with groups like the Sinister Six, it always felt like their team-ups were manufactured due to the fact that they had a common goal, And even when that was the case, more often than not, Spider-Man was merely an obstacle interfering with them, rather than being the prize to be won. But Batman's villains are not like that, because they are constantly having run-ins with one another, getting in the other's way, and only putting aside their differences when they realize that they hate Batman more than they hate each other. And in fact, many of them have gone so far as to turn this vigilante into a totem that's representative of all the pain and suffering they've endured, causing them to end up being the monsters they are. So rather than taking responsibility for the poor decisions they made, they'll instead often blame Batman for their rotten luck, making their hatred of him much more personal and less of a means to an end. Batman's villains I also feel have formed stronger bonds with him, resulting in them having a variety of different types of relationships beyond just good guy versus bad. A prime example is the character of Mr. Freeze,
The Iceman cometh.
who is, in my opinion, the most sympathetic member of his rogues gallery. Freeze's story, as you know, is about a man trying to save his wife from an incurable disease, and doing so by placing her in a cryogenic chamber in order to buy them more time. But then, as a result of an accident caused by a fellow business partner of his, Freeze himself is then poisoned, and rendered into a condition where he can no longer survive outside of sub-zero temperatures. So now, feeling like he has nothing to lose, he has dedicated his life to getting revenge on those who put him in the suit, and finding a cure to his wife's illness by any means necessary. He's a character who Batman has a lot of empathy for, but due to situational circumstances, is forced to take him in to both protect Victor and everyone around him. It's a tragic twist of fate that places them on opposite sides of the law, but ultimately it's what he has to do. And rarely does his story ever end with anything less than heartbreak. And meanwhile, Spider-Man just doesn't really have something like this. The closest example would be the character of the Lizard, but even then, his story is nowhere near as tragic, being simply a man trying to use science in order to reclaim what he feels is keeping him from being whole. But Dr. Connors was living a perfectly fine life before the experiments that would change him forever, and more often than not, after his lizard-like transformation has passed, he can just go back home to his wife and kid, or at least until, they leave him.
But it's not all just fists flying and asses getting thrown in the prison cells. Wrapped up in all this high-flying mayhem is a bit of romance, and both characters have indulged in this connection with one of their rogues. They're also both cat-themed for some reason, that being Catwoman and the Black Cat. But once again, I gotta give it to Batman in this regard, considering the fact that with Felicia, the bond she shares with Peter is that of a thrill seeker, looking to push him further away from one half of his identity, and urging him to be Spider-Man full-time. She's only in love with half of the character, and views the other one as little more than dead weight. And while I think this is an interesting relationship worth exploring, in my opinion, it can only satisfyingly end in one way, and that is for them to go their separate ways and forge their own paths.
Bye, Felicia.
And maybe bang occasionally. You're all adults here. And if you're not, plug your ears, grown-ups are talking. And while there are plenty of stories you can tell with these characters outside of a relationship with one another, but the problem has always been that the writers have had difficulty finding a purpose for her beyond these engagements. I don't know, maybe the solution is to team her up with Silver Sable. Anyone thought of that yet? Meanwhile, Batman and Catwoman's relationship is far more layered and goes through many different highs and lows, since neither one is really attempting to change the other, and instead are more or less performing a dance, as a result of both of them being too stubborn to accept the happiness they both crave. Batman's relationship with Catwoman pushes her to be more forward-thinking and consider what she wants in the long term, and Catwoman meanwhile helps Batman work the stick out of his ass, and to an extent lighten up and be less self-serious about everything, learn to have some fun with the role he's found himself in. They're a natural positive pairing that have real potential, and simply just need to grow a little bit more to cultivate such a romance. And finally, if we're talking about impacts and relationships, then we've got to look at these guys' arch rivals, which in Batman's case, pretty much just comes down to one person, excluding Calendar Man, of course.
I was hoping you'd entertain my kid's birthday party, you pussy!
And as you can tell, I'm speaking of the Joker, a character who I've already spoken at length about, and as you can tell, I'm trying to not give too much limelight to in this particular discussion, simply because, of course, he's the greatest rival to the Dark Knight. Damn near a perfect counter to every single thing Batman stands for, the Joker is the antithesis to Bruce Wayne's mission, pushing him to even consider breaking his one rule. He's a madman defined not by logic or reason, but by how much chaos he can release on the rest of the world, in some kind of a sick, twisted game that only he knows the rules to. And considering how much harm he's done to both Batman in his public and personal life, it really makes sense why he's considered to be the Dark Knight's greatest adversary. A sentiment his wall-crawling counterpart doesn't share, because while Spidey does have his fair share of criminals who have put him through the ringer, it is more hotly contested as to who exactly is his greatest adversary. With multiple Green Goblins, various stages of lethality and venom, and an extra-dimensional vampire looking to make him into a quick snack. It's just a bit harder to gauge which one is the cream of the crop,
leading to a discourse that Batman just simply lacks. And while you can claim that characters like the Green Goblin have taken away love interests like Gwen Stacy from him, the Joker too has also robbed Batman of such love, either via killing them or twisting them into monsters similar to himself. Add on the killing of Robin,
Maiming of various close allies, and the squashing of any hope that this cycle will come to an end,
and to me the victor of this final round is very clear. And once again, Batman takes the point, leading to him taking home the win
in this 3-round head-to-head.
So between the two, I do think Batman does come out on top in terms of the villains department based on their variety and the impact they've left on the character. But that's not to discredit the web-slinger, because his opponents are too a triumph of storytelling, creating some of the most memorable bad guys this medium has ever seen.
He's right.
With a vast assortment of stories to choose from, ranging from high sci-fi to crime dramas,
to outright psychological warfare.
Spider-Man carries with him an amazing list of memorable stories, supported and defined by the villains, who he risks his life protecting the city from. But stacked up against the Batman, it's very clear to me that he is the one, the greatest rogues gallery in comic book history.
Or at least this would have been the verdict until they introduced the character of Paul. Because I don't care what crimes they're guilty of, ain't no one in Arkham have had the audacity of putting Batman in the chair. Hey, thanks for watching, and if you stuck all the way to the end, why don't you check out another one of our videos on screen now? And if you'd like to chat with us directly, come join our Discord, link in the description below.